Welcome to This Week in South Carolina. I'm Gavin Jackson. Election 2024 has come and gone, and former President Donald Trump has been elected the 47th President of the United States, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris in an extraordinary and divisive campaign. To break down the state-level ramifications, I'm joined by South Carolina Public Radio's Maayan Schechter and communications consultant Rob Godfrey. But first, we have a recap of this week, starting with the presidential race. Tuesday was the culmination of a years-long bruising presidential campaign that at one point featured two South Carolinians and was complete with twists and turns up until the end, with America finding out early Wednesday morning that former President Trump, who refused to accept defeat 4 years ago, was convicted on several felony charges and survived 2 assassination attempts this year, managed an incredible political comeback to become the 47th President of the United States. Trump addressed his supporters in Florida after flipping several key battleground states.
We made history for a reason tonight, and the reason is going to be just that. We overcame obstacles that nobody thought possible, and it is now clear that we've achieved the most incredible political thing. Look what happened. Is this crazy? But it's a political victory that our country has never seen before, nothing like this. I want to thank the American people for the extraordinary honor of being elected your 47th president and your 45th president. And every citizen, I will fight for you, for your family, and your future. Every single day I will be fighting for you, and with every breath in my body, I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. That's what we have to have.
Vice President Kamala Harris ran an unprecedented and breathless sprint of a campaign over the past 100 days since President Joe Biden stepped down from the race in late July. Yet she couldn't shake the vestiges of the administration when it came to the economy and immigration, voters' top issues in this race. Despite attempts to bring in some disaffected Republican voters, Harris saw slippage in key minority groups and demographics, according to exit polls.
I will never give up the fight for a future where Americans can pursue their dreams, ambitions, and aspirations, where the women of America have the freedom to make decisions about their own body and not have their government telling them what to do. We will never give up the fight to protect our schools and our streets from gun violence. And America, we will never give up the fight for our democracy, for the rule of law, for equal justice, and for the sacred idea that every one of us, no matter who we are or where we start out, has certain fundamental rights and freedoms that must be respected and upheld. And we will continue to wage this fight in the voting booth, in the courts, and in the public square. And we will also wage it in quieter ways, in how we live our lives, by treating one another with kindness and respect.
Further down the ballot were all 124 House and 46 state Senate races. However, more than half of those were unopposed on Election Day due to how the Republican majority House and Senate drew those 2022 maps. And on Tuesday, the Senate flipped 4 seats to gain a supermajority of Republicans, like in the House. State Republican Party Chairman Drew McKissick said the party didn't pick up all the state House seats it wanted, but it continued to grow, especially in the PD region.
From the Low Country to the PD to the Midlands to the Upstate, South Carolina continues to realign its electoral politics with its traditional conservative philosophy by electing more and more Republicans to office up and down the ballot in South Carolina. We aggressively work not only to defend our incumbents, but also to expand the playing field, to use what we knew would be a wave of support for President Trump to pick up as many other seats at every level as we could all around the state. The results speak for themselves. We held our supermajority in the state house and we added 1 seat to it. We picked up an additional 4 seats in the state Senate, giving Republicans a Senate supermajority for the first time in over 150 years, winning 34 out of 46 seats. And as I mentioned earlier about, South Carolina's electoral politics more aligning with its traditional conservative philosophy, I mean that especially in areas like that. I think that's a perfect example of that. In the last, 3 or 4 election cycles, we've seen little ink blots begin to appear, if you will, in the PD and now have expanded. Darlington County is a perfect example. We flipped a clerk of court, a clerk of court switch parties. We've had a coroner switch parties in Darlington within the last year, and then last night we win a sheriff's race. We win a solicitor's race that has part of Darlington County, and then of course the Senate race. Again, I go back to the point where when you make those kind of changes happen, and they're not sexy, it's not the kind of thing people focus on necessarily. But when you get those guys at the super local level begin to switch parties or run as Republicans, you have that many more people who will vote a straight ticket, and then it helps the rest of the ticket going up. These are people who've been conservatives all their life. It's just now getting to the point where they can win as a Republican in that area. So they begin to align their party preferences with their philosophy.
More than 2.5 million South Carolinians voted in this election, including 1.5 million who cast their ballots early or by absentee. This fueled a more than 76.5% voter participation rate, the second highest since 2008. The state's 18-point margin for Trump, the strongest for a Republican presidential candidate here ever, drove those down-ballot races that the South Carolina Democratic Party didn't have the resources to combat, according to State Chairwoman Crystal Spain.
When it comes to the Senate, we knew that it was going to be a tall order to hang on to all the Senate seats that we needed to keep. And that's why we invested unprecedented resources and fostered an unprecedented cooperative effort between us, the Democratic Party, and the Senate caucuses, and with our local party organizations. And this collective effort is just a testament to the commitment that we all have to elect Democrats up and down the ballot. I think that, like I said, Trump ended up having a pretty strong tailwinds last night. And like I said, our races were targeted. So we were talking to the voters in the districts. We didn't have one big blanket message, especially in the Senate. Those messages were really research driven. So I can't say that was the case. I really feel like a lot of our races couldn't hold on just because of the tremendous turnout on the Trump, with the Trump being at the top of the ticket.
There were no surprises in the 7 congressional district races. Voters in the 3rd congressional district easily elected the first new Republican representative since 2010, with Sherry Biggs replacing retiring Congressman Jeff Duncan. Biggs won a 7-way June primary and a runoff by 1,100 votes. She cast her ballot early in Walhalla last week.
Well, I think we're very vulnerable, and I don't know that we have ever been in this predicament as seriously as it is right now, with our border crisis and with the economy, as I previously mentioned. And I think there's a lot at stake here, so we have to make changes. And I'm very happy to see all the voters turn out. And I think on Tuesday we'll see the change that people are demanding.
Others in the congressional delegation held onto their seats as expected, maintaining the 6 Republicans and 1 Democrat that make up the delegation. 1st District Republican Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who survived a June primary, defeated Democratic challenger Michael B. Moore by 16 points in the most expensive state congressional race this cycle. Winthrop political science professor Scott Huffman said Tuesday night that while Mace has solidified a 3rd term by a 16-point margin, thanks in part to the stronger Republican-drawn district map upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in May, she still has an ideologically changing and growing district.
When you are that outspoken, you make yourself a target for, getting primaried by people who are unhappy with you. She makes enemies just as easily as she makes friends. She can be very controversial. So, how popular she is today, that could fundamentally change by the time 2026 rolls around. That's a safe Republican district. It's going to remain a safe Republican district. But Nancy Mace, and she wants to be a loose cannon, and she can be a loose cannon. Whether or not she maintains her strong base, that remains to be seen. But right now, she's got it. As Kirk said, she's going to get double digits, low double digits, but double digit win. Whether or not she can hang on to that or talk herself out of any leadership position or anything in the House, we'll see.
Joining me now to discuss the election results is South Carolina Public Radio reporter Maayan Schechter and communications consultant Rob Godfrey. Y'all, welcome. Election 2024 is over, I think. It's officially.
Yeah.
But Maayan, I want to talk to you about the State House. We'll talk presidential ramifications in a moment, but I want to talk about how things shook out down the ballot when we're talking about the State House races. We heard from SCGOP Chairman Drew McKissick in my segment a minute ago, but I want to get some more granular details about some of those races, those 4 Senate seats that were flipped by Republicans. Tell us about those and where they were and basically how close they were.
Yeah, I don't think anybody can argue that Republicans had a really good night, not just obviously in D.C., but down ballot, especially here in the South Carolina State House. And like you mentioned, Republicans were able to flip 4 seats in the state Senate held by Democratic incumbents, including 3 who had been there for quite a long time. You have State Senator Mike Fanning, and that's a race that we'll talk about that is incredibly close. Vernon Stevens in the Orangeburg area, that was redistricted. Gerald Malloy, coming from a county that is shifted toward Trump. And then also Gavin Jackson, coming from Clarendon County, a county that basically has flipped red. So those were the 4 seats that they lost in the state Senate. Democrats did lose a seat in the House, and we can talk about that in a minute. That membership in terms of Republican Democratic is still pretty balanced. But in the state Senate, with those 4 flips, Republicans will now have a supermajority, which gives them the ability to, sit down filibusters, carry out their priorities. Both of you both know, obviously, that Republicans, despite the lack of a supermajority in the past several sessions, were still able to carry out the priorities that they wanted. But those are big pickups for the Republicans. And those shifts really happen. You have a combination of these rural areas are just trending more red. These are areas that voted for former President Donald Trump in 2020 and in 2024. Redistricting played a huge role, but so did, frankly, campaigning. You had incumbents who had been there for a while, were working off of a lot of name ID, even maybe some other down ballot help, and it just didn't work out for them in the end.
Yeah, especially in that straight ticket voting there too.
And I agree with a lot of what Maayan said. I think that what we'll look back on as this cycle and this year is kind of the final farewell, with the exception of a bright spot in Senator-elect Russell Ott. We'll look back on this as kind of a final farewell of the rural Democrat in South Carolina, a trend that's been happening since really Governor McMaster was the chairman of the South Carolina Republican Party. It continued under the leadership of Caton Dawson when he was chairman of the Republican Party. And you see this, and you've seen it more and more each election cycle. And a lot of times with senators, it's coincided with the fact that straight ticket voting at the top of the ticket for the president has gone a long ways to help them. This year, Donald Trump ran up a margin that I don't think anybody expected in this state. And I think that some of those Democratic senators who were incumbents were the victim of that, politically speaking. And so, I don't know that there'll be many rural Democrats that we'll see elected in this state going forward.
Yeah.
And in another race, in addition to Russell Ott, is obviously the one to replace outgoing Senator Thomas McIlvain. Democrat Jeffrey Graham won that race. And so, yes, those are those shining spots for Democrats, especially like you mentioned in those rural areas.
Yeah, so it could have been worse for Democrats that night.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so far they're hanging on to those races. And then even with Heather Bauer in the House and Spencer Wetmore in the House too, those were some close races that Democrats held on to.
Yeah, I think the Republican Party thought that they were going to be able to flip more seats in the House. Back in 2020, they flipped 2 seats, which ironically, those seats no longer exist because of redistricting, and those lawmakers are no longer in the House. In 2022, Republicans flipped even more seats in the midterms, and so they really did think that with the flips they had, especially in the Senate, that they would see that in the House, and they just didn't. They did pick up Joe Jefferson's seat. That's kind of that Dorchester, Berkeley area. But yes, you mentioned Heather Bauer. She represents one of the swingiest, if you will, parts of Richland County. I mean, that race was pretty much deadlocked. And she only won in 2022 by, I think, just a few votes over 200. she more than tripled that. She beat former Representative Kirkman Finley by over 1,000 votes. So yes, I would say that Democrats feel especially good about that race. Also, Representative Spencer Wetmore in the Charleston area. That was another district that Republicans in the last few weeks had thought that maybe they could also pick up. And while they were able to keep their incumbents in Charleston, which is still a little bit, I think, of a surprise for a lot of Democrats were able to keep Spencer Wetmore in that place.
Yeah, to mention that that Heather Bauer race, I think that she's an example of an incumbent who didn't take anything for granted, and that's going to be increasingly important for Democratic candidates to keep in mind. She was always out there holding town halls. She was talking to constituents all the time. She's very well known and very high profile in the community. And she got involved in some local issues that I think people cared about a lot. And I think that, in some of these Senate seats that we didn't see that. And I think that, again, those senators probably lost their races due to some straight ticket voting. But also, when we're talking about, these GOTV efforts, you talk about a lot of door knocking, you talk about a lot of things that I think are becoming more and more antiquated. Door knocking may be the new rotary dial phone of the 21st century. And we're underestimating, even in rural areas, the impact that the changing media ecosystem and communications ecosystem, where people are getting so much of their information from their phones, from places like TikTok, from places like Instagram Reels and stuff like that. So a lot of that national messaging that got people super engaged in the presidential election, I think also got people engaged in the election in places like Clarendon County, where Donald Trump ended up running up a much higher margin than he ever had before.
And it seems like we're talking about, the quality of a candidate too, versus some of these incumbents who maybe feel a bit more comfortable, then all of a sudden things are changing and then they have to get out there and really kind of hit the bushes and try and get people, and then they realize the bushes are full of the opposite party at the same time.
I think that's right. I think that I don't while I don't want to totally downplay the fact that messaging matters, that candidates matter. The fact is that Democrats in some ways, I think, underestimated in these rural areas the small c conservative cultural issues that voters care about. And also they underestimated perhaps some of the quality of life issues that are being talked about all around the country. People want to be able to put food on their tables. People want to be able to do things, as simple as when they get off work, go and buy a six-pack of beer or a case of beer and not have to pay, twice as much as they did, 4 or 8 years ago for it.
Or buy liquor on Sundays. We'll see about that this session.
That's right.
But Maayan, I want to ask you about, when we talk about priorities, we're talking about legislation. What are we hearing now from the leaders in both the House and the Senate, now that the Senate's going to have, if everything holds, 34 Republicans, and then over in the House, 88 Republicans. What are we hearing in terms of priorities and what they're going to do with those supermajorities now?
So both Republicans in the House and the Senate are still trying to hash out and figure out what exactly they want to do, especially with this brand new membership. There are a lot of new freshmen that they probably also need to figure out how they're going to include them in this process. But I think the number one issue that we're going to hear a lot about, and we already have, is what's known as the educational accountability scholarships. Private school vouchers are also called, what the state Supreme Court overturned. The legislative leaders were not too pleased with that, and they've already committed to going back and looking to see how they can perhaps fix the bill, fix what they passed last time, so that this new state Supreme Court will accept it, similar to what they did with the abortion ban. So I think that's number one. The governor, of course, will unveil his legislative priorities in January, and sometimes that helps kind of dictate what we will see happening in the House and the Senate, especially in the House, because the governor and the House typically have gotten along pretty well.
And Rob, you've seen that too. You worked with former Governor Nikki Haley. Y'all had a little bit more of a difficult relationship with the legislature. That's changed since Governor McMaster has taken over. How do you see the governor especially in his now last 2 years before we start really ramping up for the 2026 gubernatorial race. How do you see McMaster working with the legislature more now with this supermajority in place?
Certainly. Well, as somebody who's worked for both Governor Haley and Governor McMaster on 2 of his campaigns, I think that there's obviously a much better working relationship on the front end for Governor McMaster, and he laid out yesterday some of the priorities in his post-election news conference that he's going to be continuing to work together with the General Assembly on. And those are priorities that he'll not only benefit from an increased Republican majority, working on, but those are priorities that he sees many of as bipartisan. For example, school safety, putting school resource officers in every school, funding for mental health, those types of priorities. He's going to count on Republicans and Democrats to work on those things. And I think that's a great thing in South Carolina and something that's unique for our state.
And just to add on to that, as both of you know, so much policy that gets passed is not in the form of individual bills. It's in the budget. And that is obviously an area where we've seen the governor and the House, where the budget starts, really work together, an area where, of course, Democrats and Republicans come together and work on that. But I do think, again, regardless of that and regardless of the vouchers, we will probably see bills pop up. Thousands of bills get pre-filed every year. I'm sure we will see things that probably align more with this change in a more conservative legislature.
No question.
But then, Maayan, when we talk about, this everything's sounding so good and perfect for the Republicans, they're still, they still have to work together. When we're talking about supermajorities, they don't all agree on the same thing at the same time, especially we're in the House where there are different factions at play too. Maybe can you forecast what we might see happen there? Or, we're talking about the House Freedom Caucuses, which is a very conservative, far-right faction there. About, I guess, maybe a dozen or so members claim membership in that. Where do you see that going? And what have you heard from lawmakers when it comes to trying to work together to get things through the State House?
Well, we've long heard Republican leaders in both chambers say they do not want to become Congress, especially this last iteration of Congress where it felt like nothing could get done in the U.S. House of Representatives. So far, I don't think we've necessarily seen some of that lockjamming of legislation getting stopped. The House Freedom Caucus, especially the new iteration of it, does feel very emboldened after these primary elections in June. They were able to flip a couple of seats of longtime Republican incumbents who were great allies of the Speaker. And so they do feel emboldened that this is a legislative session that they'll be able to move some of the issues that they care about. And, to their credit, they did help sort of push some issues to the forefront in the legislative session, although I don't know if Republican leaders would necessarily agree with that.
Different tax, yes.
Right. I do think we're going to continue to see that style of infighting in the House. I don't think that is going to completely go away. And, there are some other things that are going on in the background that could change that or help hurt that. Who knows? But I think, especially when you talk to a lot of the conservative legislators in the House, the emphasis has always been on the Senate, right? Because the House passes a lot of bills in a legislative session, and then the Senate typically slows it down. They're the deliberative body, and that's what they like to do. And sometimes that's not a bad thing. But a lot of House conservatives feel like finally, maybe with these changes in the Senate membership, they can see some of the bills that they've been trying to push faster actually move through. So we'll see. I mean, there is a, I think, a much more conservative tilt that is occurring in the South Carolina Senate. We'll see if they go through the same kind of headaches that leadership in the House has gone through.
Yeah. And then Rob, with a few minutes left, just talking about looking forward to 2026. I know we're just wrapping up 2024. No one wants to talk about that. But of course, now that's the next big race. We're talking about the governor's race. We'll be on the ticket. Senator Lindsey Graham's seat will be up for election again. How do you see maybe the posturing start next year? Where do we go when everyone starts, it's 2025, we know it's on the horizon. I mean, you're talking about the Democrats really not having much left in their bank. I mean, we looked at the 2020 race with Jamie Harrison versus Lindsey Graham, and that was the most expensive Senate race at the time, and they still couldn't get below 10 points. So how do the Democrats approach the next big iteration?
Of course, the governor's race in 2022, was even far worse for Democrats.
With Joe Cunningham,
But I think what we'll start to see is the governor's race take shape. around mid-year. You know, it's completely reasonable to let the legislature have their organizational session and to do the business that these new supermajorities are elected, or the one new supermajority is elected to do. And I think people are going to be most interested to see, you know, what that looks like. But you will start to see a governor's race take shape. It's going to be an extraordinarily historic one. It's going to be the first open one since 2010. There are statewide elected officials who have their eyes on running to succeed Governor McMaster, who you know, is on track to be the longest-serving governor in the history of our state. And I think we know who those statewide officials are so far. You know, we have the sitting Attorney General, Alan Wilson, who is said to be looking at the race. I don't think he's, you know, come close to making a decision on that yet. And the same goes for the Lieutenant Governor, Pam Ebbett, who's also been looking, you know, at what her next move would be. And I don't think she's, you know, close to making a decision. But what I'm looking for more than, you know, what those two candidates are going to do is what we might see a legislator or two or three do,
yes.
or what
Everyone's
a
gonna shoot
member
their shot.
or what a member of the congressional delegation is going to do, because we have certainly ambitious members of our House delegation. You know, Nancy Mace comes to mind. You know what she wants to do, where she wants to go, and we have someone. You know, we have candidates who've run for other federal offices, and we have members of the General Assembly.
I was going to ask for predictions, but we just got a couple right there from Rod Godfrey, communications consultant in South Carolina Public Radio's Maayan Schechter. Thank you both for being here with us. I'm Gavin Jackson for South Carolina ETV. Be well, South Carolina.